The 2020 census, manipulated by the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, did not count all Latinos, according to a study. The 2020 census did not count 1.5 million Latinos and almost 3% of African Americans, according to a recent study released this past week. Welcome to Radio Labio's English program, where I share the most interesting notes of the day that you may not have had time to catch up on. I'm Juan Andres. I podcast in English and Spanish to ensure that all Latinos can have access to our programs, regardless of what language they speak. Thanks for listening. The calculations provided in the Urban Institute analysis are another indication of a probably incomplete registration of the Latino community and very young children in the 2020 census, which is greater than the incomplete registration in 2010, said the president of the Association of National Latino Elected Officials, NALEO. Population censuses have never been and never will be perfect, but the challenges and obstacles in conducting the 2020 enumeration were especially numerous and varied, from politicization to the pandemic, and the accuracy of the data was probably affected, said the Urban Institute. As a result, according to the Institute's calculations, more than 1.5 million Latinos and almost 3% of African Americans were not counted in the census. Also, almost 5% of children under 5 years of age were not counted. Among people who rent a house, the incomplete registration was more than 2%, and in households with an immigrant present, the incomplete count probably reached close to over 3%. The population and housing census is carried out in the U.S. by constitutional mandate every 10 years, and its results depend on the distribution of the representation of districts and states in the federal Congress and the Electoral College. Now you understand why President Trump was meddling with the census and wanted certain questions so Latinos would not participate. And to a degree he succeeded. Even though the judge removed some of those questions, he left a lot of people uncomfortable in participating because they didn't know if what they answered would be turned over to ICE. Very, very sad situation. But there was a reason for this. And I'll read this again. The population and housing census is carried out in the U.S. by constitutional mandate every 10 years. And its results depend on the distribution of the representation of districts and states in the federal Congress and the Electoral College. That means that if you count less Latinos and African Americans, then there's going to be less districts. And who goes to Washington as a representative? People who represent districts in the United States go to the House of Representatives. And also, less electoral college representatives. And if you remember, once there's an election, the electoral college representatives are the ones that vote for president. So there was a reason. What a coincidence that only African Americans and Latinos were undercounted this strongly. And in what districts? You see? Now, if they're undercounted in California, it won't make any difference because the population of California is so big that the Latinos are going to have representation. But if you're in districts where there are areas in a city where there's a large Latino population and you can undercount it, and by that small number, you can eliminate a representative that represents those Latinos, like, let's say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. If her district Latinos would have been less, and that would have been merged with another district to make up the population for the representatives, and in that other district there were more non-Latinos, Ocasio-Cortez would have never been elected, and there would have been less representatives in Congress, the House of Representatives, and also the Electoral College. So there's always ill intent when these things happen, and you have a divisive president who's always looking to cheat. It's okay if he wins legitimately, but this man is a cheater and a liar. He wants to win at all costs. It doesn't matter. The results also drive the distribution of billions of dollars in federal education, housing, infrastructure, and social benefit programs. So there you go. There'll be less money going into those Latino districts because they don't have any representation, so their schools won't be updated. Their children will be less educated. They'll end up serving those that are educated. These findings are consistent with the warning signs we saw in the distribution for political representation released by the Census Bureau in April. These data indicate that total population growth between 2010 and 2020 was the second slowest in any decade in the history of our country. We were growing, but we were growing with minorities. So what do you want to do? When the white population is decreasing or not growing at the same rate as the minorities, you want to underrepresent them. You want to pull any trick in the book to make sure that they don't get to Washington and they don't get any money to achieve the voice that they need to be fully representative. These data indicate that total population growth was the second slowest in a decade in the history of our country. We also saw evidence of potentially incomplete enumeration in the data when in states with significant Latino populations and where a gain in congressional seats was expected, there was none, or it was less than projected. None in Florida and less than projected in Arizona and Texas. What a coincidence. Now, these are states that Republicans control: Arizona, Florida, and Texas. And those states were targeted for less Latinos and less African Americans being counted. Why? Come on. Come on. It's a way of cheating. Why is undercounting during the census a problem? Why are overcounts and undercounts harmful? When a community is undercounted, fewer federal dollars are sent there. When a community is overcounted, more federal dollars are sent there. The disproportionate allocation of funding further exacerbates inequities across the country, targeting people of color. This is all a master plan. Stop to think of it. What did the Trump administration and what are Republicans trying to do? Get rid of Latinos. through deportation. If you have to keep them in the country, no path to citizenship, because then they can't vote. Make sure there's no immigration reform, so they'll have to work for next to nothing. And maybe they'll go back and go away. And then cheat on the census so there's less money going into their communities and schools. So if they stay here, they can't compete. This is all malicious. It's all with intent. And it's part of the war between the Democrats and the Republicans. Why do the Republican Party want to change to an autocracy? Because that would be the max. If they can get control of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and in 2024 get a candidate that believes in Trump's philosophy to the presidency, or Trump himself, they can change the laws of this country, and then they don't have to fight the deportations, the path to citizenship, the immigration reform, the cheating on the census, because they'll change the laws to where we won't count. This is serious. Get ready to vote at any cost. You're thirsty? Hey, suck it up. You got to go to the bathroom? Suck it up. Your feet are tired? Suck it up. You hungry? Suck it up. This is that serious, that important, that even if you're suffering any one of the things that I've just mentioned, you don't leave the voting line until you've cast your ballot. This is big and serious. I'm Juan Andres. You can find us on more than 60 sites on the internet where you can listen to our podcast. Just ask Google Radio Labio and bingo. We'll show up and you'll be able to pick one of the sites that we're available on and listen to our podcast. On my behalf, as well as my colleague Yvonne Encinas, and our manager and fellow on-air personality, Francisco Maldonado, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.